Hello everybody! Today we are going to cover the installation of the GameMaker engine so that way we can begin our game development projects. The first thing you'd want to do is to head over to this link over here, gamemaker.io/en/download. Just navigate there in your browser of choice, and then depending whether you are a Windows or a Mac user, just be sure to click download. And then over here in your downloads, be sure to just click the new exe file, click yes. It might not have shown that on my recording, but it just says, are you sure you want to make changes to your computer? Just click yes, and then this little setup wizard will begin. You'll see this agreement. You can just agree. You can install Opera GX if you want. The rest of these are good, so you can click next. Then just choose your location in your folders. The default is usually good enough. And then just let it download and install. And then we can click next and click finish. Easy as can be. And once it closes, it will automatically open GameMaker for you. And then just be sure to click install on any platforms you'd like to upload your games to. Be sure you have Windows or Mac VM installed for whichever platform you're currently on so that we can play your own games. HTML5 is nice too, because sometimes it's nice to upload your games to the web. Very easy way to share them with other people. And that's all I'll download. Android if you want to put it on a phone. Alright, so now that GameMaker is installed, we will be ready to make our first game project. See you on the next lesson. Hello everybody! Today we are going to create our first GameMaker project. So if you head on into GameMaker, you'll be greeted with this screen that shows you a list of all of your projects that you have worked on and the history and when you've worked on them. And you might get greeted with this setup wizard if it's your first time opening GameMaker, but you can feel free to close that, as for today I will be your personal wizard. The first thing you want to do in this Get Started area is to click New. This will create a new project, and you're greeted with a couple options here. You can make a live wallpaper, so a fancy animated wallpaper to use with Wallpaper Engine on Steam. You can make a game strip, which has something to do with Opera GX, but for now we can ignore these other two options and just click Game. And when you click Game, you can see a list of game templates, which is pretty fun if you want to kind of mess around with a pre-built game to kind of figure out how the engine works. But for today, we're going to start with a blank game project. All right. Once you've clicked your project template you want to start with, you're going to name it. So for this, I'm just going to do Intro to GameMaker, and then make sure it's in a location that you like. It's in somewhere in your hard drive that you'll remember in case it doesn't show up in your recent projects later. And then just click Let's Go. All right, now you're in the GameMaker editor. It might be a little intimidating if it's your first time seeing something like this, but it's all right because I'll guide you through it. See you in the next lesson. Hello everybody! Today we are going to look at the GameMaker editor. Alright, so the first time you open up a GameMaker project, you'll be greeted with this big intimidating screen that has a lot of things that might just be a lot to understand all at one time. So we're going to start today by looking at the asset browser. This pane here shows all of your assets. In game creation, an asset is anything that composes a game, any sort of file. So all of your characters, all the pictures, all of your code, all of your levels, every single thing in your game is an asset. And you'll see a lot of folders here that go over every type of asset that you can have. And you can even create your own folders. Here they're called groups. But for now, we're just going to use the folders provided for us, as it's a pretty good organization structure to start out with. So everything here is a type of file that you can use in your GameMaker game. Today, we are just going to focus on a small subset of these for our introductory course, those being objects, rooms, scripts, sounds, sprites, and yeah, that's about it. So the sprites are any image in your game that will make up any of the 2D characters, enemies, objects, weapons, bullets, projectiles, anything really. All of the pictures, everything you see, will go into sprites. Sounds are self-explanatory. These will be all the sound effects, all the music for your game. We have scripts where all of our code is going to go. We have rooms, which constitute the levels of your game. We're given a starting level here. It's just a bit basic. It has nothing in it really at all. And this little home icon here will indicate your starting level so that when you create more rooms, the game will know which one to start you at and which ones you'll go to throughout the course of your game. Objects are pretty much everything that exists in your game. So you might be thinking to yourself, but what about sprites? Well, sprites themselves are just the image, whereas the object is the image linked up to all of its behavior. But we'll cover that more in a little bit. But for now, that is the asset browser section of the GameMaker editor. And yeah, see you in the next lesson. Hello, everybody. In our last lesson, we covered the assets section of the GameMaker editor. And in today's lesson, we are going to briefly go over the rest of what you might need to know about the editor for the rest of this course. So this right here, this big blank thing in the front of our screen, is the workspace. The workspace is a pretty unique feature to GameMaker that serves as a place for us to organize and edit our assets. So let's say we were to create a sprite. It would appear in the workspace and we can edit different things about our sprite, and we can work on our animations. We can change collision data about our sprite, and we can change the size of it. We can really edit anything about our sprite. But let's say we create another sprite. Instead of opening in its own window, it opens in a small sub-window in our workspace. So if we wanted to move back to our other sprite, we could scroll back up with our scroll wheel on our mouse, or we could use the middle click button to move around our workspace and navigate. And we can even move around any of these windows just like you could any window on your computer. Whoa, you can even move your workspace outside of the GameMaker window as a whole. But now you can edit all of your sprites. You can even open up some sound files. You can open up your objects. You can really, all of the things available to you, all of your assets in the game kind of exist in this one 2D space that you can kind of organize any way you want, and you can move around. You can kind of visualize your game at a glance by zooming out, or you can kind of zoom in a lot if you really want to look at these buttons in a kind of weird pixelated way. But you'll notice whenever you click on any of these assets, on the left side of your screen, all of these options will also appear to you in the inspector, which is a nice way to edit your assets on the fly while you might be in another window, such as the room window. So when you click on one of your rooms, it'll open in its own window aside from the workspace. So that way you can edit your level, place objects, move objects, all that we'll do later. But for now, all you need to know is that you can edit everything about your room over here. You can edit your individual assets, or if you go in the workspace, you get to have a nice view of your entire game at a glance. In the bottom here, you'll see this output tab, which will be important later, as if our code is throwing errors at us, if we've messed something up terribly, or if our code is acting in an unexpected way, you'll see that output here. And we can also put lines in our code that'll print stuff out to the output, which won't be visible to the player playing the game, but might be valuable for us during development. In the top of your screen here, you will have a few options. some of the most important ones include saving your project. Always do that after every single one of these lessons, please. You can build your project, which we will go over later when we're all done and ready to send it off to other people and play it in its own exe file. We have different windows where if, let's say, I accidentally closed one of these, you can get it back over here. We have some tools, which aren't really important to us right now. We have a marketplace where you can get some assets. You'll have your layouts. So if you've been using GameMaker for a long time and you say, really like your asset window over here instead of on the right, you can save that layout. Or if maybe multiple people are working on your game and they all like different layouts, you can save and load different layouts. We have a help section here, which includes this button to open up the GameMaker manual, which will be important when you're deciding to maybe code something you've never coded before, or you want to learn how part of the engine might work. But thankfully, you have me here today, and I'll be your manual for this GameMaker introduction. And this toolbar right here allows you to save and open new projects. And this button will allow us to run our game. Right now, our game is a very, very exciting game. It's of AAA quality. Well, we can't even launch our game because we made a sound that doesn't exist. If we delete this here and we click play and open up our game, you'll see a blank screen because we don't really have a game yet. But you can close that or you can press stop with this button. And that is pretty much all you need to know about the editor for now. Great. See you in the next lesson. Hello, everybody. Today we are going to cover importing sprites into our GameMaker projects. So, when creating a sprite, the first thing we want to do is to right-click on our sprites folder, hover over Create, and click Sprite. When naming any assets in a GameMaker project, we want to start with a short acronym for the type of asset that is. For sprites, it'll be SPR, and then we're going to do underscore and the name of our sprite. The first sprite we're going to import is for our player character. If you're anywhere else in a workspace and you want to focus on your asset, all you need to do is double-click on the asset of choice, and it'll bring you over to its position in the workspace. So now that we have this sprite here, we are going to click Import and navigate to your included asset pack that comes with this course and click on the player.png sprite. It will say that importing a sprite is not an undoable action. You wish to continue, you can just click Don't Show This Message Again and click Yes. So here is our player character for this project. Over here, you'll see the size of the sprite is 32 by 32 pixels. And in the top right here, you can see this thing that says top left. This is the origin for our sprite. In GameMaker's coordinate system, if you try to ask for the position of the sprite, it needs to give you a certain number. And here you can determine whether that number is the top left of the sprite, or the top right of the sprite, the bottom left or the bottom right. Basically, we're determining what point on the sprite is its singular position in space. What we're going to do right here is click this drop down and select middle center. This will be useful later when we're rotating the sprite, so that way it's not rotating about some random point. It's actually rotating about the center. We want to create 3 more sprites today, those being SPR wall, SPR arrow, and SPR background. So we'll import our wall for the wall, import our background for the background, and then for the arrow, we're going to do something interesting. When you click import, you'll see that this arrow appears to actually be a set of 4 arrows. But what you're seeing here is an animation. So in order to split these 4 pictures of an arrow into one 4-frame long animation, we're going to first click Edit Image, and then in the top of our screen, you'll see this image button on the toolbar. And if you click Convert to Frames, we'll be given this dialog here. This dialog here will allow you to determine how you want to split up your image into different frames of an animation. So some animations are fully horizontal, some are fully vertical. It just depends on how the asset is created. This one is a grid of 2 by 2, so we want to put 4 frames in our number of frames and 2 frames in our frames per row. It's already decided the size here based on the size of the picture divided by the frames in the row is 32 by 32, but sometimes there might be some spacing on the left, right, top, or bottom, or there might be space between the sprites and they're not as tightly packed as they are in this arrow. But for here, all these default settings seem to work just fine. 4, 2, 32, and 32. Then if we click Convert, we click Yes, and then here we have our animation for our spinning arrow. As you can see, it appears very fast. If you would like to slow that down, we would go to the sprite and edit the frames per second up here. So in GameMaker, our game is going to be running at 60 frames per second at default. And this is a 4-frame animation. So it's currently appearing to be a very fast moving arrow, blazing speed in its rotation. But I think it would look a little bit better if we made it something smaller. How about 10? Maybe that's even a bit too slow. How about 15? There we go. That's like a fast moving arrow and it seems about right. And we're also going to center this on the middle center. And let's do the same for our wall and our background. All right, that's all for now. See you in the next lesson. Hello, everybody. In today's lesson, we're going to cover how to create our own unique sprites for our GameMaker projects. So in our previous lesson, we imported sprites from a provided asset pack to create our game. But one of the things that makes GameMaker unique is that we can create our own sprites inside of the engine itself without using a separate program. So let's create a new sprite here and let's do SPR custom player as the name for this sprite. Sprite assets will default to 64 by 64 as their size. But for this, let's just move to, say, 32. And if you would not like it to be square, then we can uncheck this maintain aspect ratio and you can make, say, a wider or longer type image. But 32 by 32 is what we're going to use right now. And then you can click Edit Image here and you will be shown the Sprite Editor panel. So in this Sprite Editor panel, we actually have a pretty robust image editor. We start off with a standard brush that we can use to draw any shape we really like. We have a color picker with a history of our previously used colors here. If you click on a color itself, you have a fully featured color picker. And if you used a color before and you switch away from it, if it's not in the history, you can also use this color picker tool to come back to your previously used color. You can erase pixels that you've drawn. You can completely replace one color with another if, let's say you have 5 different types of enemy, but the only difference is one has greens where all the others blues were, etc. You have the fill tool, which is common in a lot of image editors. It will fill up any given space with a color. We have a line tool to draw straight lines from any point to any other. We have a rectangle tool to draw a square. You can also draw filled rectangles and squares. The same goes for circles and ellipses. And we even have a polygon tool, so that way if you do multiple clicks, you will draw a shape of that many sides. And beyond that, you have a whole host of fantastic tools at your disposal. You can also change the size of your brushes and erasers if you would like, say, to draw a large square or to draw circular sized dots in different places. And if you would like to make your sprites even more precise, in the top here, you can view the grid tool where, say, for this 32 by 32 grid, we can go, say, make it a 4 by 4 grid. Using the grid tool is very valuable for things such as making sure that any circles you draw are perfectly circular. So that way you're not working on a sprite for 20 minutes and then you realize you've actually made an uneven circle. I've made that mistake many times myself, but with the grid tool, that's not a problem anymore. But let's say you're working on something and you find out it's not exactly centered. You can use the rectangular select tool to move your selection around. So what we've made here is a bit of an abstract art piece, if I say so myself. But if I wanted to make this an animated abstract art piece, all I have to do up here is click this plus, and then it will generate new frames for us. If I would like to use my current frame as a basis for my next frame, I would just need to click up here and press Ctrl D, and that'll duplicate my frame. Or you can use the rectangular select tool to copy a part of your frame and paste it. We don't even need to use Ctrl V, it actually just, whoa, it turns our entire brush into our selection. That's really interesting. All right, so with this beautiful masterpiece that I've made here today, that concludes our lesson on GameMaker's built-in sprite editing tools. See you in the next lesson. Hello everybody. In today's lesson, we are going to cover importing audio into your GameMaker project. So the first thing you're going to want to do is right-click on your sounds folder in your asset browser and go over to Create Sound. Just like with sprites, where we rename our asset using the type of the asset in the name, here we are going to do sfx_bg music. Because the only sound file we're going to use in this project is going to be our background music. And then to add your sound, just click this little ... right here, navigate to your asset folder, click on any of your audio files, and that's about it. If you have a lot of audio files in your game, or if they're really long, you might want to consider compressing it. And as for these options down here, the only thing you really need to change is to set your output from mono to stereo. And I would highly recommend double checking the audio level of your sound, as I cannot count how many times I have played an early developer's project and had my ears absolutely blown off by their background music or a random sound effect, or especially explosion sound effects. I feel like they always come very loud when you find them online. So let's turn this down a bit, maybe around here. Yeah, that might be a bit too loud. Let's just maybe go here, rewind to the beginning. All right, that sounds about right. I think that would be good. All right, and that's pretty much it. See you in the next lesson. Hello, everybody. In today's lesson, we are going to create our first objects in our GameMaker game. So, to create an object, just like the rest of our assets, we're going to right-click our Objects folder, move over to Create, and then move to Object. For this object, we're going to use obj as our prefix. And I'm going to start with our player. So the first thing we want to do when we create an object is to select our sprite from among our sprites folder. For here, we're going to use our player sprite. And then here we need to select our collision mask. And this isn't something we've gone over before, but let me move over to our sprite here to show you. The collision mask is the space in the sprite that is considered when calculating any collisions between objects, whenever something's bumping into each other, whenever something's hitting anything else. We'll cover this a little bit more later, but it's good to know that GameMaker in general kind of defaults the collision mask to, it kind of draws a box around the outermost pixels of a sprite. So in general, the default collision masks are pretty decent, but it's generally a good idea to double check everything before moving on. So collision mask, the same as the sprite, And then for these 4 options here, visible just covers whether or not the object is seen when it is first instantiated. So some things might want to be invisible when the level starts, but then you turn them on later. The solid option will make it so that whenever a sprite attempts to move into the object, it will automatically stop, which seems nice, but the problem is the game will never process the collision as actually occurring. So if you want to, say, make something bounce off of a wall, or if you want to make it so that some damage calculation might be done on a collision, or anything at all when something collides other than just purely the object stopping, solid would not serve your purposes there. So generally, I recommend to keep this off, and even if you want something as simple as the player stops when they walk into a wall, we can just code that up ourselves. Uses physics covers the physics system of the engine, which we will not be covering in this course. And the persistent option should be checked if you want the object to stick around when you swap between rooms and levels. So for instance, let's say you're making a dungeon crawling game, and when you move between rooms, you want to make sure that the player's inventory, their health bar, and, well, I guess the player in general stays on screen and you're not deleting and making a new character every time you switch screens. That's when you'd use the persistent. And then for events, parent, physics, and variables, we will cover these in the later lessons. All right, so now we've made our first object. Let's create objects for our other sprites. Let's create an obj wall and an obj arrow. We will not be creating an object for our background, as backgrounds are handled differently. So for our arrow, let's make sure our sprite is selected, and for our wall, let's make sure our sprite is selected there. And that's about it. See you in the next lesson. Hello everybody, and welcome back. In today's lesson, we are going to learn how to place objects in our level. So in our last lesson, we created some game objects, and we are finally ready to place them in our level. So when you double click on the room, you will be presented with this blank black screen. And the first thing we want to do is head over to the left here and change the width and height of our level. For this, we are going to change it to 750. And for our height, we are going to change it to 384. All right, since we're working with 32 by 32 assets, and we're just going to make a small, simple scene to start, making this smaller screen will just make things easier for us. All right, and after you have changed your screen size to this smaller level, let's head over to the background. For our background, we can select any of our sprites. For this, we're obviously going to choose the background, which is this little dirt or sand texture. Currently, it doesn't seem like much of a background at all. It's only really in the corner here. But these options here will help you with that. We can have a default color for our background. So changing the color of the background might be a nice way to create multiple levels with the same background. But if you just change the color a little bit, you can make it seem like a new environment. But for this, we're just going to keep it at the default white. And if you want to expand it to the rest of the screen, you have a couple options here. We have the stretch option, which will stretch out our texture to the size of the room. We have horizontal tiling. So if you made a very tall sprite, it would tile across the screen. And then you can also select vertical tiling, or you can select both to duplicate our background texture across the screen. And that's what we're going to do for this. You can also set a speed for your background. Let's click play here. So a scrolling background might be useful if, say, you made maybe an auto runner or some kind of game where you might be like on a train and you want the background moving regardless of what's going on in the level itself. But for this, it's kind of making me a little bit nauseous, so I'm going to turn the speed back to 0. All right, so now that our background is created, let's select one of our objects and make sure we are on the instances layer. It's a little hard to see up here, but you just make sure you click instances, and then you can drag your object in, And now we have our wall. But if we're going to cover all the sides of our screen with this wall, that will take ages. Thankfully, we can hold the Alt key on our keyboard to just click and drag and create multiple instances of our wall instantly. And then you can click and drag. You can really just draw your wall everywhere. You can Control Z to undo. And let's say we're drawing a straight line. Whoa, I never draw it perfect on first try. I was trying to mess up like that. Let's say you've messed up, but you don't want to delete the walls one at a time. You can hold Shift to select a bunch of objects and then press Delete. Now let's also pop a player into our scene and one of our arrows. Let's launch our game to check it out. So here we have our player character. The screen is surrounded by walls, and we have our little animated arrow. Great. You've created your first level, and that's it for this lesson. See you next time. Hello, everybody. In today's lesson, we are going to cover events in GameMaker. In our last lesson, we placed some objects in our GameMaker scene. But without any behavior, these objects are no different than their sprites. In order to add some behavior to an object, let's double-click on our Objects menu, and here you will see a blank list of events. An event is a circumstance, or I guess an event, that causes code to run. For instance, if we click Create here, you will see a code window open, and here's where we'll put all of the behavior that occurs whenever our player character is created. We have a very wide array of events available to us. Let me explain them to you. So create runs whenever the object is first spawned in. Destroy is code that runs whenever an object is destroyed. So for instance, you might want to spawn in an explosion animation whenever a missile is destroyed. The step events are 3 events that occur every single frame. There's begin step, which occurs at the very start of every frame, all 60 frames per second in default. We have the step function, which occurs after the begin step, and the end step function, which occurs at the end of every step. We have these alarm functions, which are a couple built-in events that allow us to run code based on time-based events. We'll cover that later. We have our draw functions, which occur after the step, and they have the same pattern as step, where begin runs, then draw end runs. And then after all of that, we have draw GUI. By having draw GUI after all of the draw events, we can make sure that all of our UI elements, like our score counter, our health bar, anything like that, will appear above our objects and won't be overlapped by any of the elements in our game. We have our mouse events here, where left, right, and middle pressed will run whenever the mouse button is first clicked. Left, right, and middle down will run for all of the frames in which the mouse is down, and then released will occur when you let go of the mouse button. The same is true for every single key on the keyboard here, and we have key pressed and key up for every single key on the keyboard. We have gesture for mobile games, including dragging, double tapping, pinching for zooming, rotating. We have collisions, which are objects that occur after any element collides with any other specific element. And then we have our other events, which are a bunch of different events that can occur at many different points, including your animations, when the room first starts, when the game first starts. And then lastly, we have our asynchronous events, which are a bunch of events that might take longer than a single frame to occur. For instance, grabbing something from a web-based database, or saving and loading the game, or waiting for an in-app purchase to occur in a mobile game. The beginning step, end step, key down, key press, the timing of this all might be a bit confusing at first, but I have a little graphic that might help us out. So here's a graphic covering the timing of key presses in GameMaker. So whenever you press a key on your keyboard, you'll see the key pressed event occurring. And then every frame in which that key remains down, the key down event will occur every single frame. And then once you release the key up event will occur. So key pressed, key down, key down, key down, key down, key down, key down, key up. And then to explain the timing of steps, it gets a little bit more complex, but just remember that when the game first starts or whenever an object is first spawned in, the create event fires, and then every single frame, the step begin event for every object on your screen will occur, and then the step event for every single game object will occur, and then the step end event will occur, followed by draw begin, draw, the end of draw, and then all of the draw GUI events. All right, that's all for this lesson. See you in the next one. Hello everybody. In today's lesson, we are going to finally start our series of topics in coding in GameMaker Language, also known as GML. So in order to start coding, we're going to add an event like we learned about last time. We're going to click Create, and we will see right here our GameMaker code editor window. GameMaker Language is a language custom to the GameMaker engine, but if you've programmed before, you can imagine it as sort of similar to Python. And thankfully, if you haven't programmed before, the principles that you will learn in learning GameMaker Language are very applicable to any other programming language that you'll encounter. What you see here are two pre-provided lines, and these are called comments. Comments are not code in the traditional sense. They don't run, they don't have any functionality, they don't change anything about our character, and they don't affect the game in any way. But comments are very important, so that way you can write notes to you or anyone you might be working on a project with. So here you see a special tag on this comment with an @ symbol and description. Here we can use this description tag to describe what we are doing inside of our create method. What we're going to do here in our create event is we're going to say printing starter text. So we're going to press Ctrl S to save our code. And here you'll see the description is updated to printing starter text. And to make your own comments, you would just do 2 slashes and write really whatever you want. And we're going to delete this comment here and write our first line of real functional code. It's a bit of a tradition when programming, when learning any new language, to start with what is called hello world. Basically, we're going to just write the words hello world. And the way we do that is we type show _ debug _ message. And we're going to put an open and close parentheses to mark what are known as the parameters of this function. For this function, it's expecting inside of these parentheses a string, and a string is basically programmer speak for any words, letters, or a whole sentence. We denote a string with 2 quotes, and what we'll do here is we'll type hello world. And then when we run our game by pressing this button up here at the top or pressing F5 on your keyboard, we can see in our output window down here the phrase hello world. Ta-da! That was your first line of functional code in GameMaker. Now we are going to also use our code to reinforce what we learned last time about the difference between key down, key pressed, and key up. So let's go to key pressed, and for the letter W, we will put show debug message W pressed. And we'll press Ctrl S on our keyboards to save. It will also automatically save your code when you run the project, but it's good practice to save whenever possible. And then for key down, let's put show debug message W down, save. And for key up, let's show, where is it? There it is. Show debug message, open and close parentheses, open and close quotation marks, W released. All right, let's run our game and press W. And you can see down here that W pressed, W down, and W released. Aha, we've learned something new. It turns out it is registered as down and pressed on the exact same frame. And then if we keep pressing W, we'll see a whole bevy of down, press, release, down, press, release, down, press, release. And when you're done running your game, always be sure to close it out, because I cannot count the amount of times in which I would run the game, go back into the window, edit some code, and the game would still be running in the background. It'll become a lot more obvious once we add music to our game, but it's always good practice to remember we need to close our game with either the X button or the stop button up here. All right, that's all for this lesson. See you next time. Hello, everybody. In today's lesson, we are going to cover variables and data types in GML. So what is a variable? A variable can be thought of as a box that you use to store some type of data. And then this box can be passed around in the code into different parts of the code, and then different parts of the code can look at the box and they can see the data on the inside and they can modify the data on the inside. And then when it is passed to other parts of the code, that data is persistent. To create a variable, we just need to click add right here, and then we need to name the variable. Different programming languages have different preferences or different naming conventions as to how they want the variables to be named. So just like how we named our assets with like an acronym, underscore, and the name of the asset, here we are going to just include the name of the variable, but if it's multiple words, we want to put underscores between the words. So let's say variable, we could do my underscore variable to start. And these variables come in many different types. The first type is real. A real number is any positive or negative number that includes or doesn't include a decimal. So we have 1, 12, 123, or 123.55555. We can make it positive, we can make it negative, we can make it as large as we want, we can make it 3.14159. I don't know any more digits of pi, unfortunately, but so basically the real number includes any positive, negative, decimal, non-decimal, any types of numbers. But if we want to restrict our number to only existing in its whole form, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, if we try to add decimals to it, it will not work because an integer represents any positive or negative number that does not include a decimal. Our next data type is string, which represents a word, as we saw before. So here we can have hello world, we can have a whole sentence, we can have, welcome to my game, and we could store that as like welcome message, for instance. But if we go back to my variable, we can define string as a single letter, a single character, anything you could type in a text file. Those are your strings. We have booleans, which represent true or false values. And then we have expressions, which will not be covered here today. We have assets, which are anything in our game. So if we want to, say, spawn multiple assets or change the character's sprite, we can reference it via an asset variable. And then we have a list, which defines, a list of variables. Think of, for example, your grocery list as a list of strings where you might have apples, bananas, oranges, so-and-so, as all of the elements of a list. But it can't be defined here. We just need to define it in the code. And then our last asset is colors. So you can define a color here if we want to, say, reskin our character depending on a certain state in our game. And those are all of the data types that we have. So let's set our variable back to an integer. Let's default it to 0. And let's use our code from earlier to show how variables work. So let's try this. Whenever W is pressed, let's set my variable back to 0. And let's do every time the W key is down, we're going to add 1 to our variable. Your initial instinct might be to type something like my variable plus 1, but this is not how code is defined. This is just an expression. So this doesn't really do anything. If you want to assign a variable to something, you want to type my variable equals, and then you can make it equal to itself plus 1. All right, so now our variable is defined, but we need a way to see it, print it, and understand what's going on. In our debug message here, we can add to our string, we can write my variable right here, but the problem is it's expecting a string in this show debug message. So we can do something called casting the variable by writing string around it, and then it will add to the string our number of our variable. So let's save our code here, run our game, and check it out. All right, so let's press W. And if you look down in our output here, you'll see that it starts at 1 because it's initialized to 0, and then key pressed runs for the first time, setting it to 0 again, and then we add 1, add 1, add 1, add 1, add 1, until it's released. And then if we were to go back into our game and press W again, it'll go back to 0 before first writing W down for the first time. This is an important thing to remember, that the down will register before the first time that press is registered. It might not matter in like 90% of scenarios, but that's a good thing to remember down the line if you ever encounter any bugs that might be very hard to explain. So let's remember to close our game, and that is the end of this lesson on variables. See you next time. Hello everybody, and welcome to another lesson. In today's lesson, we are going to cover movement in GameMaker and how we can write code using the GameMaker language to add some movement to our players and other game objects. Firstly, I wanted to start with a little math review and do a quick explainer on how coordinate grids work. So the standard coordinate grid that you might have learned about in a math class includes 4 primary quadrants in which the center is 0, 0, and as you expand out to the right, the x goes up, and as you go to the left, the x goes down. As you go upwards, the y goes up. As you go downwards, the y goes down. So any point in this 2D space can be expressed with an x and a y number. In this coordinate, we have positive x, positive y. X would be negative and y would be positive over here. X would be negative and so would y over here. And x would be positive and y would be negative over here. But in GameMaker, this coordinate system is a little bit different. In GameMaker, the coordinate system starts at the top left, and that is the 0, 0 origin of the game room. And as you move to the right, your x increases until you reach the end of the screen, which is called room width. So no matter the size of the room, you'll know that room width corresponds to the end of your screen. Same with y, where y starts as 0 as you're at the top, but as you go down, it increases until it eventually reaches room height. And then when you're in the exact bottom right corner, that is when your x is at its maximum of room width and your y is at its maximum of room height. Another thing to note is that these coordinates do not end at the end of the room. They could go off to infinity. So for instance, you could have some projectiles start way past the screen's boundary and move left until they're eventually visible by the user. And if you're making a side-scrolling platformer, you can place level elements out to the side as far as you would like and have it all scroll as the player moves. Let's start with some player movement code. The first thing we're going to do is delete this code from earlier. All right, so the easiest way to manipulate a character's x and y values is by changing them directly. So in our key press, we can set the player's x equal to a certain number. So we can set it to say 250 and set the y to, let's say also 250. And then let's press play and see what happens. Currently our character is at this predefined position that we placed him in when we made the room. But if we were to press the W key, his position would move to 250 and 250 on the grid. If we press it again, nothing happens because 250 is hard-coded for the x and the y values. If we want the player to have some movement and make sure they move every frame, then we can look at some new values known as h speed and v speed. Let's set our h speed equal to 5 here, and let's set our v speed equal to 2. All right, let's start the game. And now when we press W, our player starts moving, and they will keep moving forever. Every single frame, they'll move 5 pixels over in the horizontal direction, which corresponds to X on our graph, and 2 points over in the vertical direction, the Y on our graph. And since both of those are moving upwards, it moves us right and down. If we were to say, have our V speed be negative, then our player would move upwards. But as you can see, we're just pressing the W key and the player continues moving forever. That's a bit of a problem. And the reason that problem occurs is because we're never setting the speed or the velocity back to 0. So one way we can do that is in the key press, we could set our velocity equal to, say, 5. And then on our key up, when we let go of the W key, we can set our H speed equal to 0. So let's try that. Press down the key, the player moves, we let go, they stop moving. Perfect. That is probably the most basic player movement you could do. But my preferred way of doing player movement isn't with this velocity when the key is down and the key is up. I prefer to keep everything in the key down. And the way we can do that is instead of using the velocity, we can change the X every frame by ourselves. So here we can do X equals X plus 5. Or a little shorthand for this, X plus equals 5. In programming, the action of adding something to a variable that's already been initialized is something you're going to do so many times. You're going to do this hundreds, if not thousands of times when writing your game. So they have written a little shorthand for us where you can do plus equals a number instead of having to write the variable name down each and every time. This isn't that much of a problem with X, but as we get longer variable names, it can get really annoying. All right, so let's do X plus equals 5 in the key down W. There we go. That operates exactly the same as when we set the player's velocity. All right, so now that we have made the player successfully move in one direction, I would like to issue you a challenge. I would like you to implement basic WASD movement for the player, leading off of my example. One thing you might have noticed is that when we're pressing W, our player is moving to the right. But what we actually want is the player to move up when we press W, right when we press D, down when we press S, or left to press when we press A. Using this coordinate grid here and the code you already wrote to make the player move right when pressing W, please try out this challenge and implement the rest of the player's movement. All right, so now I would like you to please pause the video and come back when you've had a try at the challenge. All right, now welcome back. Hopefully you've had a successful run at the challenge. I'm going to provide you the solution now. So when the player presses W, we're going to want to change the Y since we want the player to move upwards. Now normally Y would be positive in any other coordinate grid, but in GameMaker it's negative. And then we're going to go over here to the Events tab, and we're going to create a new event for whenever our other keys are down. Let's do whenever A is down, whenever D is down, and whenever S is down. All right, so S, we want the player to move downwards, so let's do Y plus equals 5. And then for D, we want the player to move to the right, so that would be X plus equals 5. And for A, we want the player to move to the left. So in GameMaker, that would be X minus equals 5. Well, not 55. That's far too fast. All right, let's try it out. So now, whenever we press one of these movement keys, our player will slide around the screen up, down, left, right. You can even go diagonal if you're pressing two of the keys at once. But there's a slightly better way to do this. Let's say we are designing our game and later on we decide that 5 is too slow or 5 is far too fast. We would have to change that number in all 4 of these different places all at once. But we can make this a little bit quicker by using our variables that we learned about last time. So let's make a new variable here called player speed. And let's set it to a real number, so that way we can use decimals. And let's set it to 10. All right, now for all of these, let's change our predefined number, what we sometimes call in programming magic numbers, to the player speed variable that we defined. All right, so now we can test it. And if we decide, whoa, 10 is way too fast for this game. This player is zipping around the screen like nobody's business. We only need to change that number in only one place in order to test a new speed value. Just another example of the power of variables in programming. All right, that's it for this lesson. See you next time. Hello everybody, and welcome to another GameMaker lesson. In our last lesson, we created player movement by directly editing the X and the Y characteristics of the player. We added and subtracted from the player's physical coordinates in space to create movement whenever we were pressing the keys. And in this lesson, I want to go over another method of moving things in GameMaker. Let's start off by creating a script for the create event on our arrow. Now, as opposed to specifically changing the horizontal vertical speed and the X and the Y of our object, our arrow is going to use just one variable called speed and another called direction. So let's start by learning about direction. Now, as a little math review here, a circle consists of 360 degrees. So if something were to turn 360 degrees, they would turn all the way around. If something were to turn 180 degrees, it would just flip the opposite way. If something were to turn 90 degrees, that's a 1/4 rotation towards 360 degrees. So in GameMaker, if you were to say something is rotated 0 degrees, it would just appear as the sprite is drawn. But if something were to rotate 90 degrees, it would appear as if it were facing upwards. 180 degrees, it would appear as if it were facing to the right. And 270, it would appear as if it were facing downwards. Now, if we were to go all the way back to 360, that would be exactly the same as 0. So that's why this circle goes from 0 to 90 to 180 to 270, straight back to 0. Now let's test that by setting the speed of our arrow equals to 1 and our direction equal to 0. Now, as you can see, our arrow is moving ever so slightly to the right. And then if we were to set its direction to 90, our arrow would be moving upwards. Now, if we were to say, go in our step function and change the direction by 1 every frame, we would see our arrow do what? It would slowly be moving in a circle as it's moving a little bit every frame, but then its direction is going up and down and to the right. And every 360 frames, or 6 seconds, it'll end up exactly where it started. Now, if we were to change the speed of that, our arrow would be moving in a much bigger circle. And what if we were to change the speed every frame as well? What would happen? You'd see our arrow moving in circles of slowly increasing size until eventually the arrow will be moving so fast and in such a large circle that I don't think we'll ever see it again. So one thing to know about this other movement method is that even though we're using the direction and the speed, our arrow still has an H speed and a V speed. So if we were to show debug message, and we were to print out our horizontal speed of our arrow every frame, you would see over here that it's constantly changing as our arrow's speed and direction are constantly changing. And if we were to print out its X, that still exists. Our arrow still has a position even though we're not directly editing it as a part of our code. The same would be true for our player if we were still using its H speed and its vertical speed as part of our player movement. But since we are directly editing the X and the Ys, the player itself does not have a speed and direction according to GameMaker. All right, so with that knowledge in your head and this method of moving our arrow, that's all for this lesson. See ya.